Have you ever watched a person lose everything they owned in the time it takes to sign a name and then be told politely that it was only business? Have you wondered what it cost a town to keep a secret buried for 18 years and what it might cost the one woman stubborn enough to dig it up? Somewhere in the high, wind-scoured grasslands of Sabine County, in the last cold spring of the 1880s, a woman with chapped hands and a dead man's chisel in her coat pocket paid $7 for a house that everyone else in Coldwater had agreed to let rot. They laughed at her for it. The banker who had already taken her father's shop, her father's tools, and her father's good name did not laugh. He simply made a note in a ledger and moved on, because he believed, as respectable men often do, that the past stays where you put it. He was wrong about that. He was wrong in a way that would take 18 years, a flooded valley, and a locked attic to prove. But I am getting ahead of the story, and the best stories are the ones you let unfold at their own pace. So pour yourself something warm, pull your chair a little closer to the light, and settle in, because this one runs long and it earns every minute. And before we go another word further, do me a small kindness. Tell me down in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. A porch, a truck cab, a kitchen at 2 a.m. I like to know who's out there in the dark with me. This is the story of Della Rourke and the $7 that broke a man who thought he could not be broken. Della learned her hands from her father, and she learned everything else on her own. Josiah Rourke was a cabinet maker, and in the years before the railroad reached Coldwater, he was the only one for 60 miles who could hang a door. So true, it would swing shut on its own weight and stop a hair from the jam without a sound. He built the pews in the Methodist church. He built the long counter at the Mercantile and the coffin his own wife was buried in the winter of 1874, when Della was 14 and old enough to hold the plane steady while her father wept and worked and would not stop working, because stopping, he said, was how a man let grief into the wood. He taught her the way he had been taught, which was slowly and without much praise. He taught her to read a board the way other people read faces, to lay her palm flat against sawn oak and feel for the run of the grain, the old wound where a branch had once been, the faint difference in temperature between wood that was solid clear through and wood that had a hollow behind it. That last thing he taught her the way you teach a child to swim, by making her do it until she could not fail. He would build a small box with a false bottom and hide a coin inside it and set it on the bench and say nothing, and Della would run her fingertips over every surface until she felt the lie in it, the seam a lesser hand had tried to hide, the whisper of empty space where the wood said one thing and the truth said another. Every board remembers the hand that cut it, he told her more than once, turning a chisel over in his own scarred fingers. You can't sand that out. A man can lie with his mouth all day. He can't lie with a joint. Learn to feel the seam, and you'll never be fooled by a smooth face again. The chisel he set it with was a firmer chisel, an inch wide, its blade honed down over 30 years until it was narrower than the day he'd bought it, its handle rosewood gone dark and smooth as a river stone from the oil of his palm. On the ferrule, he had scratched his initials J.R. with the point of an awl. It was the tool he trusted for the finest work, the paring cuts, the places where a mallet would be too blunt an instrument. When he died in the autumn of 1887, coughing out the last of a lung sickness that had come on him slow, he left Della the shop, the debts he swore he did not have, and that chisel. She wrapped it in oilcloth and kept it in her coat. She did not know yet that it would be the thing that saved her life. Cyrus Dean came for the shop 11 months later, and he came the way he did everything, which was quietly and in daylight with papers. Dean was the president of the Coldwater Land and Trust Company. He was a spare, unhurried man of about 60, clean-shaven in an age of beards, and he wore gray wool and a black string tie and a pocket watch that he consulted the way other men consult scripture. He did not raise his voice. In 30 years in Sabine County, no one could recall having heard him raise it. He sat across from Della in the front room of her father's shop, among the half-finished chairs and the smell of shellac, and he set a folded paper on the workbench between them and smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, the way you might calm a nervous animal. It was a promissory note. According to the note, Josiah Rourke had borrowed $1,200 from the trust in the spring of 1883 to expand the shop at interest, and the balance now stood at $1,412.60. The signature at the bottom was her father's. Della knew every stroke of her father's hand, the way he crossed a T low and left the loop of the J open. And she knew within about 2 seconds of looking at it that the signature was very good and that it was not real. She said, so Dean did not argue. That was the thing she would remember about him for the rest of her life, the thing that frightened her more than shouting ever could have. He simply looked at her with a kind of mild, patient sorrow, the way a schoolmaster looks at a slow child, and he said that grief made people say all manner of things, and that he understood, and that he had no wish to be unkind. Then he told her that the note was recorded and lawful, that the shop and its contents stood as security, and that the trust would take possession at the end of the month unless the balance was paid in full. He said it the way another man might read out a train schedule. He consulted his watch. He stood and set his hat on his head and told her he was sorry for her loss, and he meant the word sorry the way a stone means it. She had $41 to her name. At the end of the month, they took the shop. They took the lathe and the saws and the long bench with the marks of 30 years' work worn into it, and they took the little box with the false bottom that her father had built for her when she was 10, and they sold it all at auction on the courthouse steps to satisfy a debt that had never existed. Della stood at the back of the crowd and watched Ott Beckwith, who ran the feed store and had known her father, buy the good hand planes for $1.50 and turn to the men beside him and say, loud enough for her to hear, that it was a shame about the Rourke girl, but that a woman had no business trying to run a joinery anyhow, and that she'd have done better to find a husband while she still had a face for it. The men laughed. Della did not. She kept her hands in her coat pockets, and in the right pocket her fingers closed around the oilcloth bundle, and she said nothing at all. That silence would become the most eloquent thing about her. Months passed. Della drifted the way the dispossessed drift, west and downhill, taking and washing and mending in one dying settlement after another, sleeping in barns when the weather allowed, and in the corners of other people's charity when it did not. Winter caught her in a place called Ash Hollow, at the far end of the county where the good grass gave out and the land turned to alkali flat and broken sandstone, a country the color of an old bruise. It was the sort of place people passed through on their way to somewhere better and did not remember afterward. And it was there in the March of 1889, tacked to the wall of the county land office, among the notices of tax sales, that she saw the listing for the old Senate farmhouse. The notice described it plainly. A frame house and outbuildings on a quarter section in the Ash Hollow bottoms, seized for 11 years unpaid taxes, offered at public sale for the amount owed. No one had bid on it in 3 previous sales. The land was bad, the water was worse, and the house, the clerk told her with a shrug, was half fallen in and said to be unlucky on account of the flood. What flood? She asked. The clerk shrugged again. Before my time, he said, whole valley washed out. Way back. Nobody's farmed the bottom since. The taxes owed with interest and the clerk's fee came to $7 exactly. Della counted it out in coins on the counter, $7. And the clerk wrote her name in the book. And just like that, she owned a house that had killed whatever family had lived in it and been abandoned for 18 years. She walked out the 3 miles to see it with the wind at her back and her father's chisel in her pocket. And when she came over the last low-rise and saw it standing there, gray and sway-backed against the gray sky, she did not feel like a fool. She felt something she could not name and would only understand much later. She felt as if the house had been waiting. The house was worse up close than it had looked from the rise, and Della was glad of it because low expectations are cheap to satisfy. The roof over the kitchen had let go, and the rain had done its slow work on the floor beneath, and there were birds nesting in the parlor and a drift of blown sand in every corner and the sweet rot smell of a place the living had given up on. But the frame was oak, and the oak was sound. She knew it the moment she laid her hand on the doorpost, the way her father had taught her, feeling past the gray weathered skin of the wood to the hard, true heart of it underneath. Whoever had built this house had built it to last 100 years. Whoever had left it had left in a hurry. She could not do it alone, and she knew it, and this is where Reuben Sykes comes into the story. Sykes was an ex-miner who had come to the Hollow after his lungs gave out on him in the silver camps. A big, slow-moving man of maybe 50 with a bad temper and a worse opinion of the human race, who dug wells and cellars and graves for whoever would pay and drank whatever the paying left over. Della found him behind the Ash Hollow Saloon and offered him $1 a day and his dinner to help her make the Senate place fit to live in. And Sykes looked her up and down and laughed at her the way Beckwith had laughed, though with less cruelty in it, and told her she'd wasted $7 on a haunted ruin and was about to waste more on him. She said she supposed that was her business and not his. He said, suit yourself. He came anyway. He said it was the dinner. The next morning they began, and I want to tell you about the work, because the work is the whole heart of this story, and everyone who lived it understood that they started with a roof, because a house that cannot keep out the rain cannot keep out anything. Sykes cut poles, and Della, who could hang a door and read a grain but had never in her life set a rafter, learned by ruining 3 of them before she got the 4th right, and Sykes watched her ruin them and said nothing, which she came to understand was his highest form of respect. They tore off the rotted shakes, and Della split new ones from a stand of dead cedar a mile off, riving them out with a froe and a wooden mallet, hundreds of them, until her palms blistered, and the blisters broke and healed into calluses, and the calluses became simply her hands. They said the shakes in the rain and the wind, and once in a spring, snow that turned the whole valley white and silent. In the evenings, too tired to talk, they ate cornbread and beans by the light of a single lamp, and slowly, the way trust is always built, without either of them deciding to do it, they became partners. It was Sykes who found the first strange thing, though neither of them understood it at the time. They were clearing the collapsed kitchen wing, hauling out the ruined boards to burn, when Sykes stopped and stood looking at the fieldstone foundation for a long moment, and then said, in his flat way, that it was queer. Della asked what was queer. He said, the foundation. Said it was too big. Said whoever laid it had laid enough stone for a house twice this size, and then built a small house on a big footing, and no man wastes that much labor by accident. Della came and looked and saw that he was right, that the stone foundation ran on past the walls of the house and disappeared under the drifted sand, enclosing a space far larger than the rooms above it. There's a cellar under here, Sykes said, a big one, and somebody filled a way to it. She asked how he knew he'd spent 30 years underground. He said he knew the shape of a thing that had been closed on purpose. But that came later. First, there was the summer and the labor and the slow turning of a ruin back into a home. And I want you to sit in that summer with me for a moment before the trouble comes, because it was the last quiet Della would have for a long while. They rebuilt the well, they cleared the bottoms and turned a little ground and put in a late garden that half survived. They rehung the doors, and when Della hung the front door true, so that it swung shut on its own weight and stopped a hair from the jamb without a sound, she stood back and looked at it, and her eyes stung. And Sykes, who saw everything and said little, went and busied himself with something else and let her have the moment to herself. Ott Beckwith rode out once on some errand of his own and sat his horse in the yard and looked at the work they'd done and told Della she was a fool for polishing a coffin, that the hollow was cursed ground and always had been, and that the whole county knew it. Della kept working. She did not answer him. Sykes spat in the dust near the feet of Beckwith's horse, which was answer enough, and Beckwith rode off. Let the silent hands answer the loud mouth. Her father had never said that in so many words, but she had learned it from him all the same. In the last week of July, they opened the cellar, and everything changed. They found the way down where Sykes said it would be, behind the fieldstone, a stair that someone had bricked over and plastered and hidden behind a false wall in the pantry so well that only a man who knew the shape of a closed thing and a woman who could feel a seam in a smooth face would ever have found it. They took it down with bar and hammer over 2 long days, and on the evening of the 2nd day, the last of the brick gave way onto darkness and a smell of old dry earth and something else, something like paper and lamp oil and time. Della went down first with the lamp, because it was her house. The stair was oak, still sound. At the bottom was a room, dug out and stone-lined and dry as a bone, and in the room, stacked on wooden shelves and packed into 3 iron-strapped trunks, was the reason the Sennett family had died, and the reason the house had stood empty for 18 years. There was money, not a fortune in gold, though there was some of that 40-odd double eagles in a canvas sack, $800 in coin that would matter later, but the money was the least of it. What filled the trunks and the shelves was paper, ledgers bound in leather and stacked 2 feet high, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, survey maps rolled in oilcloth. deeds, contracts, a whole buried archive of a business, hidden by a man who had known he was in danger and had built a vault under his own kitchen to keep the truth alive after they killed him. Because the Senate who had built this house, Della would learn, had not been a farmer at all. He had been a clerk. He had been Cyrus Dean's clerk. They brought it up by lamplight, trunk by trunk, and spread it across the floor of the rebuilt parlor. And for 3 nights running, they sat up reading, Della and Sykes, 2 people who had come to the hollow with nothing and were now sitting in the middle of the most dangerous thing in Sabine County. Sykes read slow, moving his lips, but he read, and between them, they began to put it together. And what they put together was this: the next morning, and I ask you to hold this thread, because here is where the present injustice and the buried one become the same crime. In the ledgers, in a bookkeeper's small, tidy hand, was the whole secret history of the Coldwater Land and Trust Company, and it went back further and ran deeper than the present. It went back to 1871, to a thing the older people in the county called the Ash Hollow Flood, and did not like to talk about. Della had heard the phrase. Everyone had. A reservoir up the valley had failed one spring night 18 years before, and the water had come down in the dark and drowned the bottoms and the 9 homesteading families who had settled there, and it had been called an accident, an act of God, a tragedy, and it had cleared the whole valley of the people who owned its water rights. Cyrus Dean's company had bought up the drowned land afterward for the back taxes, a few dollars a parcel, and had gone on to sell the water rights to the railroad for a sum that the ledger recorded with terrible precision as $41,000. But it had not been an act of God. The ledgers proved it had not. The reservoir had been built by Dean's own company. The homesteaders had refused to sell their water and had banded together to fight the company in the territorial court, and they had been winning. And one of the letters, in Dean's own cramped hand, instructed the dam's caretaker to open the lower sluice gates on a night of high water and let the matter resolve itself. The caretaker had been paid $200 and a one-way ticket to Oregon. The survey that showed the homesteaders' claims had been altered, redrawn, the original hidden, and the original, the true survey, with the 9 families' names on their 9 parcels, was here, rowed in oilcloth in the trunk. The clerk, Senate, had done the false bookkeeping for years and had grown afraid and had begun, quietly, to keep a second set of true books and to copy the letters he was told to burn, and had hidden them in a vault under his own house, against the day he might need them to save his own neck. He had never gotten the chance to use them. In the ledger's last entry, dated a week before Sennett's own death in a hunting accident in the fall of 1871, he had written a single line, not for any court, just for himself. I have done a great wrong for wages, and I mean to undo it if God gives me time. God had not given him time, but he had given him a good oak house and a dry stone vault, and 18 years, and finally a woman with the hands to find what he had hidden. Here, I want to leave Della for just a moment. The only time in this whole account I will, and take you 30 miles east to a lamplit office in Coldwater, because you should understand the shape of the thing that was coming for her. Cyrus Dean sat at his desk that same week with a letter open before him, a letter from the county clerk, a routine thing, a monthly list of land transactions filed in Sabine County, the sort of report Dean had read 1,000 times and never once found interesting. His eye went down the column of names out of habit, the way it always did, and stopped. Rourke, D. Senate, quarter section, Ash Hollow Bottoms, $7. He read it twice. He set the letter down and looked at nothing for a long moment, and then he rose and went to the great iron safe in the corner of his office and worked the combination and looked inside at the space where certain old documents were kept, and confirmed what he already knew, which was that the most dangerous papers his company had ever produced had never been in that safe at all, because Senate had stolen them, and Senate had lived in Ash Hollow, and now Rourke had bought the Senate house for $7 and had spent a summer, he was told, taking it apart board by board. Dean did not curse. He did not sweat. He rang a small bell on his desk, and when the man he called Loomis came in, Dean told him, in the same mild voice he used for everything, to take 3 men out to the hollow and bring back everything of paper he found in the Senate house, and to see to it that the Rourke woman and whoever was with her did not remain in a condition to talk about it. He consulted his watch. He said there was rain coming off the mountains and that they had best ride tonight. Then he went back to his ledgers because there was other business. And to a man like Dean, it was always only business. The storm came the next night, and Loomis came with it. It had been building all day, the air gone thick and green, the light strange, and by dark the rain had come down the valley in sheets, and the dry wash below the house was running brown and rising. Della and Sykes had packed the most important papers, the true survey and the flood letters and the key ledgers, into a single trunk, meaning to start for the county seat at first light and put them into the hands of the law, because they had both understood, without saying it, that they were now holding something men had already killed 9 families to hide. They were not fast enough. They never had a chance to be fast enough. Loomis and his 3 men came through the rain a little after midnight, and they did not knock. I am going to tell you the next part the way Sykes told it afterward, plainly, because he was the one who understood violence, and Della was not. And because for a few minutes in that flooding dark, it was Sykes and not Della who kept them both alive. Reuben Sykes had spent 30 years underground and had buried more partners than he cared to count, and he had learned young that the loud fights are the ones you lose. So when he heard the horses over the rain, he did not shout. He put out the lamp. He put the woman behind him and the trunk behind the woman, and he took up the long iron pry bar he'd used to open the vault, and he stood in the dark of the ruined kitchen wing where the footing was bad and a stranger would not know the floor, and he waited. 2 of Loomis's men came through the front, and one of them found the floor Sykes knew about and went down hard through the rotted boards into the old foundation. And in the confusion of that, in the dark, with the man's leg broken and the man screaming and the rain roaring on the new laid roof, Sykes moved. He was not a good man, and he would have told you so, but he was a large one, and the pry bar was iron, and he had decided these men were not going to take the woman who had given him $1 a day and a reason to stop drinking. It was short, it was ugly. When the lamp was lit again, there were 2 men down who would not be getting up soon, and Loomis was gone back into the rain with the 3rd, and Sykes was bleeding from a knife cut along his ribs, and Della was standing over the trunk with her father's chisel held out in front of her in both hands, the 1-inch firmer chisel with JR, scratched on the ferrule, honed sharp enough to pare oak, and it had blood on the edge of it, and she did not remember, then or ever, having used it. But Loomis carried a mark to the end of his days, and it was the shape of a cabinet maker's chisel. Learn to feel the seam, her father had said, and you'll never be fooled by a smooth face again. She had thought, all her life, that he was only talking about wood. The dam of the new reservoir, the same company reservoir, failed again that night, or was failed. They never proved which, and it hardly mattered. The water came down the valley in the dark, a second time, 18 years almost to the season after the first, and this time there was no sleeping settlement in the bottoms to drown, only an empty valley and a single sound oak house on a rise that a careful builder had chosen long ago precisely because it stood above the flood. Della and Sykes watched from the doorway as the brown water tore through the bottoms and took the garden and the well and the 2 men Loomis had left behind and did not reach the doorstep. The house Senate built kept them, one more time, the way it had been built too. At dawn, the rain stopped and the water went down, and Della Rourke and Reuben Sykes loaded a single trunk onto a mule and started east, not toward Coldwater, where the law belonged to Cyrus Dean, but past it 70 miles farther to the territorial seat at Fort Deverell, where the law did not. I want to be plain about what Della did next, because it is the whole moral spine of the story, and it would have been so easy to do otherwise. She had in that trunk proof that Cyrus Dean had murdered 9 families for $41,000 and had tried to murder her for finding out. She had in her coat pocket a chisel that had already tasted one of his men. She had Reuben Sykes beside her, wounded and willing, and she had every reason in the world that any court of feeling would have accepted. She did not use any of it. She did not ride to Coldwater and put a chisel to Cyrus Dean's throat in his lamplit office, though she thought about it on the long road east. She told Sykes later that she thought about it the whole way. Instead, she rode past the man who had ruined her father and taken her home and tried to have her killed, and she carried the truth to someone whose hands were clean, because she had decided somewhere in that flooded dark that she was not going to let Cyrus Dean make her into a version of himself. The lawman at Fort Deverell was a United States Marshal named Ezra Prentice, a lean, gray, unhurried man, not unlike Dean to look at, but unlike him in the one way that mattered, which was that he could not be bought and everyone in the territory knew it, which is why he had spent his whole career at a hardship post at the ragged end of the map. Prentice was suspicious of Della at first, as he was suspicious of everyone, a woman in men's boots with a wounded miner and a wild story and a trunk full of paper. But Ezra Prentice had one great virtue, which was that he believed documents over men, and he sat down with the ledgers and the letters and the two surveys, the false one that was on file in the territorial archive, and the true one Senate had hidden, and he laid them side by side on his desk. And he was not a fast reader either, and it took him 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, he closed the last ledger and sat for a while without speaking. And then he said, to no one in particular, that he had been a young deputy in 1871 and had ridden out to the Ash Hollow bottoms after the flood and helped pull the bodies out of the mud and had been told it was an act of God and had believed it because he had wanted to. Then he stood and put on his hat and swore out warrants and rode for Coldwater with a federal posse at his back and Della's true survey in a leather case against his chest. They arrested Cyrus Dean on a bright still morning in the September of 1889 at his own desk among his own ledgers. He did not run and he did not shout. Of course he didn't. He looked at the warrant and he looked at Marshal Prentice and he looked last and longest at Della Rourke, who had asked to be there and whom Prentice had allowed to stand in the doorway of the office where a year before, the same man had smoothed a forged note flat on a workbench and told her he was sorry for her loss. Dean studied her for a moment with that same mild, patient, sorrowful expression, as though she were still a slow child who had disappointed him, and then he asked her, quietly, curiously, almost as one craftsman to another, how she had ever found the vault. And Della, who had not spoken a word to him in a year, who had let her silence answer Beckwith and answer the whole laughing town, chose to break it now, once, on her own terms. She told him the truth. She said, my father taught me to feel where a smooth face is hiding a hollow. Then she turned and walked out into the sun and left him to the law. The trials ran through the winter and into the spring of 1890 in a federal court far from Sabine County, and the ledgers did the work that no witness could have done, because a witness can be frightened or bought or discredited, but a company's own books, kept in its own clerk's own hand, cannot be cross-examined into a lie. Cyrus Dean was convicted of fraud, of the theft of the water rights, and in the end, on the strength of his own letter about the sluice gates of the murders in the Ash Hollow bottoms in 1871. He died in a federal penitentiary 4 years later, still, they say, insisting to anyone who would listen that it had only ever been business. The Coldwater Land and Trust Company was broken up and its holdings sold, and a good part of what it had stolen, the value of those $41,000 in water rights, grown over 18 years, was ordered returned to the descendants of the 9 drowned families who had scattered to 4 states and had to be found one by one, which took years, and which Della Rourke made it her business to see done. Now let the years run the way they do, whether we watch them or not, and let me show you the Ash Hollow bottoms as they were in the spring of 1897. The valley was green again. The company's reservoir was gone, torn out by court order, and the creek ran free down the bottoms the way it had before 1871, and along it, where 9 homesteads had once stood and then had drowned emptiness for a quarter century, there were farms again. A dozen of them worked by families who had come back to land their grandparents had died on and been given clear title to at last. There was a school, there was talk of a church, and on the rise above the bottoms, the old Senate House still stood, sound and true. Its doors hung so well they swung shut on their own weight and stopped a hair from the jamb without a sound. And behind it, where the ruined kitchen wing had been, there was a proper cabinet maker's shop, because Della had gone back, in the end, to the only work she had ever truly wanted to do. Reuben Sykes lived in a small house he built himself 100 yards off, and dug wells for the new families, and came to Sunday dinner, and never once in 8 years apologized for having laughed at her the first day, because Della never asked him to, and because they both knew that the laugh and everything after it had made them what they were to each other, which was family. There's one more thing, and then I will let you go. On the wall of the new shop, above the long bench, Della hung a single tool where the light from the window would fall on it. It was a firmer chisel, an inch wide, its blade honed down narrow over 40 years now, its rosewood handle dark and smooth as a river stone, with the initials J.R. scratched into the ferrule with the point of an awl. She did not use it for work anymore. She had other chisels for that. This one she kept clean and oiled and hung where she could see it, the tool her father had left her, the tool that had opened a false wall in a hidden vault, and once, on a night she did not like to remember, had answered a knife in the dark. When the children of the new families came to the shop to watch her work, and one of them sooner or later always asked about the old chisel on the wall, she would take it down and put it in the child's hands and let them feel the weight of it. And she would tell them the one thing her father had told her: every board remembers the hand that cut it. You can lie with your mouth all day. You can't lie with a joint. And here, at the last, is the thing Della Rourke understood. Standing in the shop she built on the rise, above the valley she helped bring back to life, and it is the thing I most wanted to leave you with tonight. They will tell you this is a story about buried treasure, about the gold in the sack, and the $41,000, and the fortune hidden in the attic, and the cellar of a house that sold for $7. It is not. The gold was the least of what was in that vault, and Della gave most of it away. The real treasure was never the money. The real treasure was a dead clerk's decision, made too late to save himself, to write down the truth and hide it where a patient hand might someday find it, and a dead cabinet maker's decision to teach his daughter to feel for the lie beneath a smooth and lovely surface. Everything that mattered came from those two choices. The rest was just paper. And paper, in the end, is only wood, and wood remembers. So that's the story of Della Rourke and the $7 and the house no one else wanted. If it kept you company tonight, do me the kindness of subscribing so the next one finds you, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the quiet, stubborn, unglamorous work of doing the right thing outlasts every clever man who thought the past would stay buried. And before you go, tell me down there in the comments, what's the smallest amount of money you ever spent on something that turned out to be worth more than you could have dreamed? I read every one. I'll see you in the next story.